Bonsoir et bienvenue sur 99media.org. Je suis en direct du pavillon design de l'UQAM sur la rue Sanguinet entre les boulevards Sainte-Catherine et Maisonneuve. Nous allons assister à une conférence de la maison Luxe Éditeur. Les riches nuisent-ils à la société? La conférence était prévue pour commencer à 19h, donc on prend quelques minutes d'entendre le temps que les gens continuent d'arriver et de s'installer, et ça devrait commencer sous peu. Merci d'être à l'antenne de 99media.org. Toujours à gauche, à droite, conférence de presse à midi. Non, bénévole de foot aujourd'hui. Non, là, je commence à dire, je t'avais de me déplacer une couple de jours, là. J'ai pas un temps libre avant mercredi prochain comme c'est là, parce que mon horaire de la semaine prochaine n'est pas fait encore, et j'appréhende déjà là qu'aujourd'hui j'ai cancellé, j'avais une journée prévue au Cégep du Vieux-Montréal dans le cadre de la semaine de la citoyenneté, que je n'ai pas été finalement parce que je voulais trouver P6, l'association des juristes progressistes faisait une conférence de presse à midi. Là j'ai découvert ça, je suis venu à Montréal. On est 19 dans le 20e, mais je suis le seul web diffuseur du groupe. C'est comme, c'est tout mon équipement, c'est moi qui finance ça, c'est ma bande passante qui est utilisée, tout l'équipement est à vous aussi, le site, etc. J'ai pas fini.
On continue, mais je comprends, on fait toutes nos affaires dans des groupes, c'est pas s'épuiser, là,
les batteries sont vides depuis, je dirais, peut-être une semaine déjà que les batteries sont vides. Puis, non, il y a d'autres choses. Puis encore là, il y a beaucoup de choses comme ça. Ce soir, c'est moi qui ai approché pour. C'est comme, hey, regarde, oui, ça m'intéresse, mais oui, je veux le sortir. Je sais que dans le monde qui me suit, c'est un sujet d'actualité que ça va être intéressé.
c'est clair. Mais oui, c'est tant qu'on donne.
Ouais,
bonne soirée.
Pareillement, bonne conférence. Oui, c'est déjà en ligne.
C'est sur le site de Luxe?
Non, c'est sur le site de 99media.org.
Oui, ok. Donc on peut réécouter en tout temps après.
Oui, puis la vidéo de ce soir va être en ligne pendant quelques jours, puis après ça, il va être disponible sur mon YouTube.
nuisent-ils à la société? Un titre qui a peut-être sourcillé quelques-uns, qui peut être un peu provocateur ou racoleur, c'est ça. Mais que nous jugions quand même intéressant ou nécessaire, puisqu'il, dans son énoncé même, s'en prenait peut-être au prestige surfait ou non démontré de la grande richesse. Un prestige, une fascination qui, je pense, c'est Keynes qui un jour a dit que la fascination pour la grande richesse était quelque chose de morbide, c'était une passion morbide, une passion qui entraînait, qui était d'abord pathétique pour la personne qui était habitée par la passion de l'investissement, parce que les gens qui consacrent l'essentiel de leur vie à valoriser l'argent, c'est une passion comme une autre, mais qui était aussi morbide pour l'ensemble de la société, puisqu'elle créait toutes sortes de déséquilibres sociaux, moraux, économiques et démocratiques. Économique, c'est intéressant, c'est important de le souligner, parce que en choisissant ce titre-là, ce qu'on voulait aussi faire, créer comme effet, c'est rappeler que dans notre société, il y a toutes sortes de maîtres. Il y a évidemment des gens qui sont au pouvoir dans l'État et qu'on a développé d'ailleurs une sorte de sport national, un accident, de mépriser avec beaucoup de style le moindre député d'arrière-plan quasi analphabète comme représentant du pouvoir arbitraire, mais on est généralement beaucoup plus doux ou prudent dans la critique des maîtres de l'économie, qui pourtant nous plongent souvent dans toutes sortes de désarroi ou d'incertitude. Voilà. C'est l'explication politique que j'ai choisie, je sens que j'avais besoin de défendre. La soirée est organisée avec en luxe, la Coop-Cam et l'Iris. C'est une sorte de trio. On va finir peut-être par s'ouvrir au droit de production. Plusieurs événements qu'on organise ensemble. Donc, ça fait plusieurs fois que je vous présente les vertus de la Coop-Cam comme littéraire qui en font tout à fait intéressant. Et aussi les vertus de l'Iris. Là, je ne sais plus comment vous présenter l'Iris. La dernière fois, j'ai dit que c'était l'Institut économique de Montréal avec un cœur et une tête. C'est ma meilleure définition. Je suis un peu condamné à la répéter. J'aurais peut-être envie de dire, un jour j'ai lu une phrase de Winston Churchill qui était assez intéressante, qui disait « Je ne crois qu'aux statistiques que j'ai publiées moi-même. » Et je pense que c'est pour ça qu'on a besoin de l'Iris. Pour avoir des gens qui truquent les statistiques dans le sens pour avoir des gens qui sont capables de rétablir les faits précisément à l'encontre de ceux qui s'autorisent de le politique sur les enjeux économiques. Et c'est dans le même esprit qu'on a écouté le livre de Nina Leroy qui s'appelle « Milliardaire, comment les ultra riches nuisent à l'économie ». Précisément, le livre vise à rétablir un certain nombre de faits sur la place qu'occupent les problèmes qui suscitent la grande concentration de la richesse en Europe. Donc, voilà, c'est ce que j'avais à vous dire, le substantiel pour ce soir. Je vais ici devant les panélistes. Mais auparavant, je voudrais juste ajouter une chose. Nina Leroy va faire sa conférence en anglais. Chaque conférence va durer une petite minute. Et pour ceux ou celles qui ne maîtrisaient pas l'anglais, on a à chaque fois que le petit trio producteur fait un événement, un coup de chuchoteur, un chuchotrice, comment on appelle ça. Donc, un service de chuchotement. Tout souvent, de traduction simultanée pour les personnes qui ont désiré de s'en prévaloir. Je vais laisser la place à Julia qui va animer la soirée et vous présenter son rôle. Merci beaucoup, bonne soirée.
Et ensuite, on va
d'hommes d'affaires. Et surprise, mais j'ai accepté. Et quand je suis arrivée, j'étais tellement surprise parce qu'il y a beaucoup de monde. Et j'ai pensé, peut-être je me suis trompée. Peut-être les hommes d'affaires s'intéressent beaucoup à mes idées. À l'idée, par exemple, qu'il faut que les riches payent plus d'impôts. Mais malheureusement, ce n'est pas exactement le cas. L'homme qui m'a présenté ce soir-là, c'est un peu différent que ce soir, et cet homme-là, il a commencé en présentant ses excuses. Il a dit, messieurs, je regrette de vous informer que nous avons avec nous ce soir Linda McQuaid, qui est ici à cause de l'annulation de notre vrai conférencier. trash carrying placards that read, "Jump, you fuckers." Anyway, I just want to point out that our book gets more into the "jump, you fuckers" genre. Anyway, I think there's a tendency to think that, the rich always get richer, right? That's what people think. But the truth is actually Canada had to make very significant progress towards becoming a much more economically equal country. In fact, if you go back to the period from 1940 to 1980, mostly the period immediately after the Second World War, you find it was a very different period. It was a period of tremendous equality, in fact. It's sometimes referred to as the golden age of capitalism, because it was a period of tremendous economic growth, but the growth was very widely shared. Sometimes called what's described as a social compact or social contract, and then it was capitalism, but the deal was the excesses of capitalism would be restrained through policy. So, for instance, it was legislation to empower strong unions. There was much more progressive tax system than we have today, including much higher taxes on corporations. And money was used to fund public programs and public institutions. And by the way, it's very important to note that even though the taxes on the rich were much higher back then, there was still that fantastic economic growth. In fact, the growth in Canada at that period, in that post-war period, was the strongest, in Canada and the strongest it's ever been before or since, which is terribly important because we're always hear that high taxes on the rich destroy economic growth, right? And yet that was the period of greatest growth we've ever experienced. And in fact, the growth was so strong, average incomes were roughly doubling every 25 years. I mean, it's phenomenal when you think about it. It sounds like this is kind of imaginary. Let me just ask, is there anyone here tonight who was born before 1980? One or two of you? Well, then you lived in the golden age of capitalism. You lived in a time when, in fact, that period was the period of greatest economic equality in modern Western history. Okay? And in fact, if you remember back then, one of the sort of points that people used to raise in the sort of popular discussions was, in the future, what will we all do with our leisure time? Because that was a big issue. But that sounds funny now, but it was actually a reasonable question. Because back then, the rate that growth was happening and the way it was being shared, there was every reason to believe that if that continued, there'd be an economic dividend and that we'd all be able to share it to some extent. And that one of the ways we would obviously want to take that dividend would be in more time off, more leisure time. Well, to make a long story short, of course that didn't happen. Of course, starting with 1980, we were basically overwhelmed by a different political ideology. We call it Thatcherism, Reaganism, neoconservatism, whatever you want to call it. We all know what it was, though, what it continues to be. It's a set of policies, tax cuts for the rich, cuts for social spending, privatization, deregulation, attacks on unions. And the effect was to slow down and, in fact, stop and reverse this trend towards greater economic inequality, or towards greater economic equality, which is the direction we're going in. Now, at the time, a lot of people said, this is just going to favor the rich under those kind of policies. But the neoconservatives, or rednecks, whatever you want to call it, they said, no, the benefits will trickle down. But now it's been 30 years. So we can actually assess that claim with complete accuracy. And we can assess it with the statistics that show that it was a complete fraud. The benefits never trickled down, they gushed out. In fact, virtually all the economic The share of national income enjoyed by the top 1% doubled in the past 30 years. The share of national income going to the top 0.01% quintupled in the last 30 years. Meanwhile, among ordinary people, we've got 69 billionaires now, 69 billionaires. But meanwhile, among ordinary people, there's been stagnation of wages, right? In fact, the median income, once you factor out inflation, is slightly lower than it was 30 years ago. And if it seems that the middle class is somehow keeping up, that's only because we're working twice as hard, right? It used to be the single earner family. Now we need 2 incomes to be in the middle class. And of course, everybody's working longer hours. And of course, that whole idea of a ledger dividend, that's just out the window. In fact, last year, the Harper government just took away from us 2 years of our ledger time with the raising of the retirement age, right? Now, let me just pause on that for a second. It's a fascinating thing. That was a major change, and yet it received not that much attention, not that much protest. Yet it's going to affect every Canadian once it's phased in. But what's interesting was that the commentators, they kind of brushed it aside. They said, no big deal. It's only logical because Canadians are living so much longer. That totally misses the point. The point is that if we had retained the more equal, more egalitarian economic system that we had back in those early post-war years, then the benefits of all the growth for the past 30 years would have been more widely shared. In other words, the dividend from that economic growth would have gone to benefit us all. So for instance, we could have taken it in more time off. So instead of actually having the government raise the retirement age, the government could have actually dropped the retirement age. But of course, that didn't happen. Now, just to give you a quick sense of the extent of the benefits we're going to talk today, 30 years ago, the typical CEO in Canada had an income that was about 25 times the wage of the average Canadian worker. And let's just acknowledge that somebody with an income 25 times your income, that's a big gap, right? So when I say that was the era of greatest equality in modern Western history, we're talking relative, okay? But that's nothing compared to the situation today. So today, the typical CEO in Canada has an income not 25 times the average worker, but 250 times the average worker. And if you look at the financial sector, it's even more extreme. So for instance, I mentioned that hedge fund manager a few minutes ago, John Paulson, who left making $3.7 billion on the subprime mortgage market. Well, okay, in 2009, he had an income that was not 25 times the average worker or 250 times the average worker, but actually 82,000 times the average worker. So in other words, that hedge fund manager made the same as 82,000 nurses. Now I ask you, how can that be justified? In what moral universe is that hedge fund manager worth 82,000 nurses? In what moral universe is that hedge fund manager worth even 1 nurse? And let me just argue that, in fact, there are enormous consequences to the rise of extreme inequality. I mean, not just inequality in general, but the kind of extreme inequality we have in Canada today. And I don't have the time, unfortunately, to get into the details of this. We have this in the book. But in terms of the social implications for the social well-being of people in society, but the economic well-being, because of course, the rise of a very powerful elite. Well, we have a whole chapter in the book explaining how that, in fact, was a key factor leading to the 2008 financial crash. So economic consequences, but the consequence that gets completely ignored, to the extent that these things are ever talked about, is the democratic consequences, okay? Because the simple truth is that economic power translates into political power. So when you have economic power concentrated in the hands of a very small number of people, what you end up is this rule by the rich, this plutocracy. In fact, a former late U.S. Supreme Court Justice, Luke Brandeis, said it beautifully when he said, we can have democracy or we can have income concentrated in the hands of a small number of people. We can't have both, though. It's one or the other. Or to put it in a cruder way, this is the way Mark Hanna put it. He was a 19th century Republican background strategist. He put it this way, he said, there are two things that matter in politics. The first is money, and I can't remember the second. Anyway, the dangers of plutocracy and undermining democracy are severe. They've always been, and you go back to Aristotle and he talks about it. But they're particularly severe today, I would argue, and that's because our capacity for destruction has grown. In the past, like kings and wealthy elites were able to wreak great havoc on populations. But today, the corporate kings and the wealthy elite, not just wreak great havoc, they have actually destroyed the planet. And I'm referring, of course, to the most powerful set of economic interests on Earth, the richest set of economic interests on Earth, the fossil fuel lobby. And the fact that they are able, single-handedly, to block any hope of progress so far towards dealing with climate change. So I make that point simply to point out that extreme inequality and plutocracy, isn't just some minor problem about being a little bit jealous or something. The consequences of it are potentially catastrophic. Now, let me just say, because I'm running out of time here, that here's the important point. It doesn't have to be this way, okay? That in fact, the notion that there's a trade-off, this is always suggested, a trade-off between social justice and economic growth. That's just not even true. It's just not even true. We saw, I mentioned earlier, in the early post-war period, very, very high levels of tax necessary to fund those social programs and everything. But also very high levels of growth back then. So it certainly doesn't mean that they don't people say, oh, everything's changed, globalization, right? No. Because we still have examples of where this model that we had in Canada exists today. In fact, it's been taken to a much more sophisticated level. And that is Northern Europe, specifically the Scandinavian countries. Okay? And we know that they have very, very high taxes, very big government, strong unions, all the things that are supposed to kill growth. And yet they're thriving in terms of the World Economic Forum in Geneva always rates them in the top 10 of global economic competitiveness. They just do fantastic on all those key economic measures. Another thing, by the way, Sweden doesn't even have a deficit these days. And yet, despite, they have all those things, at the same time, they have a wonderful quality of life due to their beautiful public programs that, of course, we hear nothing about here university tuition. Throughout the whole Quebec student protest last year, we kept hearing about, how important the Quebec students should pay attention to the tuition fees in other provinces, but never to what the tuition fees or the non-existent tuition fees were in Scandinavia. I recall, I remember one time talking to somebody at the Finnish embassy in Ottawa because I was so struck by some of this stuff they had going on there. Fascinating. You really have free university tuition? And she looked at me and she said, well, it's not really free. We make students pay a small part of their living expenses. They never pay for their beer money, that kind of thing. But the one that always kills me is the 7 weeks paid vacation for every member of the workforce. So I asked her, seven weeks paid vacation. She said, oh yes. She said, but that's not really bad. She said, not really 7 weeks. It's 9 weeks. So she said, well, yes, the employer is required to pay for up to 7 weeks of vacation. But the